I apologize. We have some technical difficulties, but I am now off of mute and you can hear me. Hi, so my name is Dawn Rowe. Thank you for taking the time to spend it with us today. I am a research associate professor here at the University of Oregon and a TA provider for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. Before that, I was a classroom transition specialist in the K-12 system in South Carolina. So thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about transition plan instruction, specifically with a focus on the transition assessment process. We hope to provide you some information that will support you in your work and working with youth with TBI. As Melissa mentioned earlier, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box and we will answer them as we go, or at the end we will provide more opportunity to answer some questions. So just for some background information, most of you are familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The IDEA requires that when a child turns 16 and earlier in some states, that the IEP team includes measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessment in the IEP. And also includes transition services that are needed to assist a child in reaching those goals. This transition services is really a coordinated set of activities, and it's results focused or outcomes focused versus process focused. And it's really on helping improve both the academic and functional achievement of the student as they prepare to move into post-school activities such as post-secondary education, integrated continuing adult education, or some other community living and participation. So just for some definitions, so we're all on the same page, coordinated just means that the activities have a purpose and a goal, with a goal in mind. And so when you select all the activities, you have a plan in mind to accomplish a specific goal. So there's some alignment between what you're planning and the outcomes you expect to achieve. Results-oriented process means that you're focused on the outcomes instead of the process. So your central question when you're planning for a student is, what has the student learned? So not what did it take to get them there, but what actually did they achieve as a result of all the activities that they engaged in school. Academic and functional achievement is really focused on standard course of study that's functionally meaningful as students set and attain goals. And that's, I think to meaningful is a really important concept. And it's really hard sometimes to disclose or to discern what's meaningful to our youth and families. And so again, as part of this transition assessment process, that's something that we're trying to figure out, is what is functionally meaningful to students and how do we prepare them to be successful after high school. School to post-school is just that. So you're moving from secondary school or high school to adult life experiences. And then individual needs, strengths, preference, and interest. So when we're thinking about secondary transition, student input is very critical. I mean, they are the ultimate consumer in this process. Their transition plan or the goals in the plan, everything should reflect what is interesting to that student. So at every point in the transition planning process, they should have some impact or some input into the process and be part of that decision-making process. For students with more significant disabilities, we may have to use a different approach, but again, they also need to be critical members of the team and be a part of that decision-making process. But you may need to use other means of communication to help facilitate planning and decision-making during the transition planning process. So for example, PIC-SIMS or some other functional communication system. And so finally, for most of the students that you will teach or work with, daily living skills is going to be really important. And I would say this is a skill that is not taught in high schools generally, but most of our students, regardless of ability level, could benefit from instruction in daily living skills. So I think that's a really important piece of transition, and I'm kind of excited that that is available, at least for students with disabilities. And then a functional vocational evaluation is the last kind of component of the transition requirements. And that really is a process that helps assess what a student can do in an employment and independence or interdependence in the community. So it's really a more thorough, comprehensive assessment process. And it's part of transition assessment, but it's not the end all. So before we begin really diving into today's content, what I would like for you all to do is kind of think about a student that you currently work with. Think about their strengths in the areas of living, learning, and working. So thinking about academic strengths and functional skills. Think about the needs they might have in the areas of living and learning. And then think about parent or student concerns that have been expressed to you all. And again, this is important just to kind of bring perspective to this, and I think it will help you if you have a kid in mind. The information I talk about today, it will be helpful to be able to apply that information, and you may generate some questions. So take a minute or two just to think of a student. So the key to successful transition is transition assessment. So if we want to make sure that we have really good transition planning, we start with assessment. It's an ongoing process of collecting information on students' strengths and interests, their preferences, their skills, their aptitudes. But all this is related to the current demands in the future career, educational, personal, social environment. So it's all in relation to what their post-school aspirations are. Transition assessment data provide a foundation for us to define individual education program goals, transition services, but it's also essential in guiding our instructional decision-making from day to day. So again, key to success really starts with assessment. Now, assessment is strengthened when teachers across the curricula collaborate to conduct the assessment. So looking at both general and special education teachers, related service providers, and other individuals who may be working with a student in the school, it's important that everybody communicate and share information, because that will help strengthen the process. You're also, when you're thinking about assessment includes both skills and aptitudes the student has and skills they need to be successful in that next environment. So inside the school facility or outside of the school facility are examined. So again, collaboration is going to help the team gather more information, because teachers typically are confined to the classroom most of the day, but there are other service providers that are in the community, or family members are also in the community, so they can help provide information about the skills needed to be successful in the next environment. Families are really a critical part of transition assessment, and students as well. They are going to give you some really good information as a starting place, and then some of the other assessments we talk about today can help strengthen that process. So the big picture is, it is a process, and it's an ongoing process of collecting data over time. And the end result is using the data for both IEP development and then for instruction. So when you think about results from the initial assessments, it's really a starting place for transition planning. It just kind of helps you gauge what skills and aptitudes the student has and kind of where they want to go, so you can begin to think about the environments you need to assess to determine what skills are needed to be successful. It really should be the driving force in determining individualized services that help ensure that the students with disabilities have the skills needed to achieve in-school and post-school goals. So again, ongoing assessment is important because students change over time. They grow, they mature, but they also acquire new skills and new abilities. And they also change their mind about what they want to do after high school. So it's really important that we are always thinking about this big process of determining what to assess, making sure we're selecting appropriate assessments, conducting the assessments, analyzing the results, and then using that assessment data. Again, the data serve as a guide for instruction and delivery of services, while simultaneously helping students make informed choices and taking charge of their planning. So the assessment data we gather, again, we should be sharing back with our students and letting our students help interpret that assessment data so that they can feel empowered to make informed decisions about the transition planning process. So just for a minute, and remember earlier I just told you to think about a student and what their strengths and areas are. And one of the important things about assessment is thinking about outcomes. Again, transition is a results-focused process. So what is the outcomes? How do we define success? And so what skills and aptitudes will the student need to be successful in the next environment? And then what will hinder success in that next environment? So are there any maladaptive behaviors that you think your student might have or might have acquired that it's going to inhibit them from being successful? So I challenge you to think about the student that you're working with and jot down some notes about what skills might be needed for success. And then what are some skills that may hinder their success? Then you also need to think about those same things across the different environments. So think about that in terms of school. So what's needed for success in school and what will hinder their success in school. And that means K-12. And then what is needed for success in their communities. And then success post-school. So thinking about either post-school employment or post-school education and training. So I encourage you to type in the chat box some of the skills you think are needed for success. And Melissa, my chat box disappeared, so I don't know where it went. All right, so again, thinking about, I hope some folks jotted down some answers. I'm not able to see the chat box. It disappeared from my screen. So, but I'll continue on. You know, the first step in the assessment process is determining what to assess. And so understanding what skills a student will need to be successful in those future environments is an important part of determining what to assess. There's lots of types of skills to assess: basic reading, life skills, non-cognitive skills. I don't know where it went.
The chat box isn't showing because you're in presentation mode, so it blanks it over.
Okay.
So, but that's okay.
Okay, well, I'll just keep going. It'll be fine.
No worries.
Thank you. You know, some of our students are also in other different facilities and are have also been in trouble or in juvenile facilities, so they also may have re-entry needs. So any need to know people, parole plans, types of placements. And I think, you know, it's really important to think about all the different students that we work with and the types of skills they need to be successful. And again, depending on the environment they're going to move into. So are they transitioning into from middle school to high school? Are they transitioning from high school into employment or post-secondary education? So depending on the post-school goals, what types of skills to assess might change. And so again, thinking about post-secondary education and training, you know, it's really important to know the basic skills of reading, writing, and math, because those are skills that you really need to be successful in post-secondary education. Some other things that will be important related to being successful in post-secondary education are those self-determination skills, persistence, problem solving, and self-efficacy. So there are definitely some skills that you would need to assess if you're going into those environments. Now, if you're working with youth through maybe in alternative settings that are transitioning back into their community schools or back into their community, again, you may have other skills to assess or other places that you might need to assess. So the important thing is about determining what to assess is that you know you have to assess both knowledge and application of skills. And so thinking about how you would do that is going to be important. So again, back to your individual student. thinking about what their next environment is going to be. So what skills and aptitudes are they going to need to be successful in that environment, and then what's going to hinder their success. So again, just take a few minutes and jot down some ideas of what you think they are going to need to be successful. So once you have an idea of what to assess, then the big task comes to select the appropriate assessments. Not all students will have the same battery of assessments. A lot of school districts will have kind of a here's the gamut of what we have to offer, but it's up to you as the individual teacher or the IEP team to determine which of those assessments are actually going to measure what it is you're trying to measure. A lot of the transition assessments out there lack depth and meaning, and any one assessment doesn't provide a comprehensive understanding of specific content as it relates to how it's going to be applied in post-school settings. The assessment that comes to mind that's the most comprehensive is the Brigance Transition Assessment, and it covers multiple areas, but it may not be appropriate for all students. And so, again, thinking about students' cognitive levels, so for example, a Brigance only for basic skills would only assess up to like 8th grade level. So that might not be appropriate for some of our students in high school, but may be appropriate for others. That also includes some other life skills that may or may not be appropriate for some of the students that we're working with. What's more important than the assessment itself is really what kind of questions you want answered. So you have to think about the questions related to the student's specific strengths, interests, and needs and preferences, but you really want to know what skills each of the students on your caseload are going to need to successfully attain their goals, and which of those assessments will actually give you some information about those specific skills. So if you want to know if the student has high levels of self-determination, is there an assessment out there that will provide you information about the student's capacity for self-determination and their opportunities to practice self-determination skills? In this case, there is, and so that would be an appropriate assessment to select. So again, many transition assessments gather information regarding interest and preference, and then a lot about perceptions of students and families or other school personnel. Some assess actual demonstration of skills. And again, when you're thinking about the assessment process, you're going to want a little of everything. You do want to have a good understanding of the perceptions of students and their families and other personnel related to the student skills. And you definitely want to know about their interests, but you also want to know whether or not they can demonstrate the skills that you're assessing. So a comprehensive assessment process is going to include gathering information about interest, about perceptions, and performance of skills related to some really broad areas of transition. So one would be academic achievement. And I think this is a really important one that it often gets left out when you think about transition, but academic skills is a really important aspect of secondary transition. And so making sure that we understand a student's academic achievement and their capacity to do well in post-secondary education environments is going to be important, especially if they have goals in that area. Self-determination is another broad area. And remember, self-determination is kind of an umbrella term that can includes multiple components like self-advocacy, self-efficacy, self-monitoring. So I think it's really important that we assess in those kinds of areas. Vocational interest and exploration is another important one. And then adaptive behavior and independent living. And if you've got students, again, that are moving from other alternative settings back into the regular school, I think adaptive behavior and independent living is going to be really important. Students with more significant impairments will definitely have assessments in adaptive living and independent living. So when you're selecting assessments, your primary considerations or things to think about is who needs the information. And so you need the information for the IEP You and your teachers may need the information to inform instruction. Your students and the families need the information, again, so that they can be informed consumers and can help to make decisions about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for them. You also want to know about what information is needed for transition planning and instructional purposes, and then what decisions can be made using the assessment data. So we're not in the business to be doing assessments just for the sake of collecting assessment data. We want to make sure that all of our assessments are purposeful and that are going to result in information that's going to either inform the IEP or the development of the IEP or inform instruction. So some other considerations in selecting appropriate assessments, whether or not assessments are formal or informal, whether they're norm referenced or criterion referenced. Some assessments are free and provide you valuable information. Others cost a little bit of money, but still provide valuable information. Depending on your student, you may need to think about alternate response modes. So whether you have verbal versus written skills, there's other technical aspects of the assessment, such as reliability and validity, that should be important. So one of the handouts that I've provided for this presentation is what we call an assessment review form. So as teachers, it's really important that we're informed consumers, and if we want to ensure that our assessments match the skills that we want to assess and will actually measure what we want to measure, we actually need to critically examine those assessments before we administer them. And so the assessment review form actually kind of helps, it just provides you some guidance on how to actually look at the assessment. So you're identifying what the strengths of the assessments are, what the weaknesses are, whether you can adapt it or not. And so it gives you an indication of whether or not you could use the assessment confidently or use the assessment results confidently, or if some other assessment might be more appropriate. So that's just a tool to help support you in your work in selecting appropriate assessments. So the next phase is really conducting the assessments. There are specific steps involved when administering assessments, and it really depends on what area is being assessed and what assessments you select. So some assessments actually have explicit procedures that you need to follow to administer the assessments. Others that are really more informal, you could do semi-structured interviews or other informal means that don't necessarily have a prescribed way of doing it. But you really want to make sure that you've documented how you have delivered it, so that because that will help in interpreting the results. Considerations, I guess, when conducting assessment is really a multidisciplinary approach, making sure that you're using multiple people over multiple days and multiple assessments. So again, I can't emphasize enough how one assessment is probably not going to tell you all you need to know to help with transition planning and instruction. It is going to take multiple assessments, and it's going to take examining perspectives of or perceptions of multiple people. Because again, the way I perceive a student's skills may be very different from the way the family perceives them or the student perceives them. And in fact, we might even learn that our perceptions might be wrong, because when we put a student in that actual situation, they can actually perform the skills with no problem. So again, thinking about conducting the assessments and how to do that. It's important that we're familiar with the assessment instrument and have the right materials on hand. Especially if you're doing more formal ones with prescribed ways of administering the assessment. You'll want to make sure that you have everything in place at the beginning. And I'll just let you all learn from some of my prior mistakes, because, you know, nobody's perfect. There's been many cases as a transition specialist when I sat down to work with students to do transition assessments, and I sit down and I thought I had everything together, but then I realized, oh, I forgot this piece of paper, or I forgot that piece of paper, and then had to pause to go get the stuff and get organized. Well, what happens when you do that is you start to lose the interest of the student. They feel that you don't value their time very much, and then they're not going to give you necessarily reliable answers. So making sure that you have everything in place beforehand is really important, and you know kind of the flow of the assessment process so it goes fairly quickly for students is going to be really important. You also want to recognize and honor the students who are different. or have cultural or linguistic differences. Building rapport with students is super important, just like in teaching in general. We always want to build relationships with our students because, the more trust they have in us, the more confident they will be in sharing what their future aspirations are and what their strengths and skills are. But it also helps them it helps us make sure they have an effective way to communicate with us. Because again, not all students are going to be successful in communicating with us verbally. They may need to communicate in a different mode to give us the information we need. So again, when you're conducting assessments, it should be a team approach. And if you think about all the folks in our schools, all of us play a role in transition assessment. We're all collecting data. It's a matter of gathering the data from the right people. So they're gathering the right data from the right people. And so when you think about transition assessment kind of broadly, you're thinking about academic skills, you're thinking about social behavioral skills, adaptive behavior, independent living, self-determination, and vocational interest and exploration. So who in the school has that kind of information? So academics is kind of a no-brainer, right? Our English teachers, our math teachers, our science and social study teachers, they are all conducting curriculum-based measures or other assessments, most likely on a daily basis, to do progress monitoring in those academic courses. And so that progress monitoring data is really important to secondary transition. And so again, as a special education teacher or a transition specialist working with the team, it's important to work with those general education teachers to ask for that kind of data so that you can better understand how the students performing in those academic courses, and whether it's issue of capacity for academic learning, or if it's another non-academic skill that's prohibiting them from being successful, like lack of organization or lack of focus, which many of our students are challenged with. So those kind of executive functioning skills. Social behavioral assessments, again, our core academic teachers do have some information around social behavior and could be really informative, but there are other folks in our schools that can have this information. So I challenge you all to think about who it is in your school that has this information, and how can you work as a team to collect it, to paint the big picture for the students so that you can understand more fully what their strengths and interests are and what their skills and aptitudes are. Now, thinking about your school in general, and this is an important one, there's lots of things either available or not available at schools, and I recognize this as some schools have more resources than others. Again, a takeaway from this presentation is to identify at your school what your resources are, because it's very well you could have resources that are going to be able to assess the skills that you want to assess. So you may have a Brigance on hand, you may have the AIR self-determination scale or the ARC self-determination scale. You may be using the transition assessment goal generator or the tag. There are assessments available. So that's the first thing, is to find out what assessments are available at your school. And then think about if those assessments are appropriate for the individual student's goals. So are they going to assess skills needed for post-secondary education and training, or are they going to assess skills needed for community living or employment? Once you identify what you already have available at your school, then you can identify if there's gaps or if you need to either purchase new assessments or research other assessments that could be useful. And I will say you can call or contact me at any time. I have, over the years, have just been collecting various informal and formal assessment instruments. Just so I have a library of instruments, because lots of folks will ask me, okay, like I want to assess this, but I don't have a tool to do it. So I can share some of those resources with you all. And that's, again, how you build your kind of assessment, is collaborating with each other across schools. I think that's important in your network of people to ask each other, because you all are using different things and can share resources across. That's going to be great. So I think we're at a moment where we can, it's your turn to talk back to me. So I'm going to, I guess we can figure this out, Melissa, how best to approach this. But I would like for you all just to kind of take a minute and think about what the first step in the assessment process is and what some considerations are for determining what assessments use, and then who's responsible for conducting those assessments. So I'm going to see if I can find my chat box again, and then there it goes. All right, so in the chat box, can somebody tell me what the first part of the assessment process is? What do you have to do before you even administer an assessment? There's nobody chatting, Melissa.
I see that. You mentioned that if there is a goal, then you should be assessing in that area. You are meaning are you meaning a student with, say, math goals, or are you talking about specific transition goals?
Oh, that's a great question. So really, what drives the entire IEP is your post-secondary goals. So all students age 16 and older should have post-secondary goals in employment and education and training. And then some of our students will also have post-secondary goals in independent living. So we start with that. So what are the post-school goal areas? And so when we're thinking about transition assessment, we want to know what skills and aptitudes a student needs to be successful in those post-school areas. So if let's say, for example, the student's goal is to be a flight attendant for one of the major airlines. That's their post-school goal. So after high school, Camille will be a flight attendant for, let's say, United. So what skills does Camille need to be successful as a flight attendant? So if we think about flight attendants in general, in order to become a flight attendant, there is some post-secondary education and training that they're going to have to achieve. So there is some education requirements. So they're going to have academic skills, math, reading, writing skills. Other skills that they're going to need to be successful are related to customer service skills. There's some physical requirements, just like keeping balance on a rocky airplane, being able to maneuver in small spaces, being able to be closed in small spaces, being able to problem solve really quickly. So executive functioning would be really critical in that kind of environment. So once you've determined the post-school goals, then it's important to think about what skills they're going to need to be successful in those areas, and then assess in those skills. So that could mean it could be academic skills, but it also could be non-academic skills, and more independent living, adapted living skills. Does that answer your question?
That was Emily who asked, so we'll see what she has to say.
Okay.
And you have a response to your first step in the assessment process.
Oh, excellent. Looks like Joanne is telling me that we begin the assessment by evaluating skills, resources, ambitions, desires, etc. the student has already in place and is already ready. Right. So you need to know what skills to assess is your first step. So understanding a student's post-school goal is going to be an important first step, because you need to understand what skills they need to be successful in that area. So Emily, it looks like you had part of a comment, but then here's the rest of it. Thank you. So let's say you assess and the information from the assessment shows what? shows that the student has the skill. So if it shows that the student can already demonstrate the skill, then when you're thinking about planning, then you may not have any annual goals or services to support it. If the student shows a deficit in a skill area needed to be successful in that post-school environment, then it's very likely that you're going to develop an annual IEP goal to help support development of that skill area, or a transition service to help development of skill in that area, or practice in that area. So if they're showing low-level skills, or their skill level is very low, then more than likely you're going to have an annual IEP goal or a transition service, or both, that's going to support them in developing the skills and aptitudes needed to be successful in that area. That's a good question. So who's responsible for conducting assessments? This is a good question. Who all do you think is responsible for doing it? Is it the special education teacher's responsibility for doing transition assessment? Is it the transition specialist's responsibility? Whose responsibility is it? And then I'll go back to Emily's question. Nice. It is a team. It's a team responsibility. So there's no I in team. So it's going to be the general education teacher, special education teacher, related service providers, and any other folks that are supporting that student in transition. So let's go back to Emily's question about making it achievable if the discrepancy is very large. So it is okay if the discrepancy is very large. Again, your goal is to help students obtain goals to increase the likelihood of them being successful in the career or either post-secondary education training area that they want to be successful in, or employment areas they want to be successful in. And so again, you're going to, as a team, you're going to have to prioritize the skills. So for some students, they're going to have so many deficits that it's going to be really hard to know where to start. And so as a team, you're going to have to sit down and prioritize the areas that are most important to work on that year to be successful. And you really kind of task analyze to do that and think about the skills that have impact over multiple areas. So you may actually choose to provide additional instruction or services and support to the skill areas that will impact their lives, both in education and in employment, or education, employment, and community living. For example, self-determination skills are important across all three outcome areas versus some skills are only important in one area. So that may be one way to start beginning to prioritize. The other thing goes back to students and families' values. So what do they value? What's important to them? Again, our transition planning needs to be functionally meaningful to families and youth. And so that is something to consider when prioritizing the skills. And it's okay that there's a large gap or in skill instruction. What you're trying to do is to help them make progress towards their outcome. Now, their outcomes may change. So they may decide that they don't want to be an airline attendant anymore. However, they still want to stay in the same field. They just don't want to be on the plane because they can't stay in small spaces, and they don't problem solve really quickly on the spot. So they may choose to work in the airport in some other position. So typically what happens with post-school goals, as you conduct more transition assessments over time, those post-school goals will become more refined. So by the time they start off really broad, like I will go to work after high school, or I will go on to college after high school. But as you get closer and closer to graduation, students get a better idea based on the assessment data and their own personal feelings. They have a better idea of what it is they want to do after high school. So again, what you're trying to do as a teacher is to better prepare them for that. So a little progress is better than no progress. So it's okay that there may be large gaps and deficits, but again, if it's a priority area, then it's our responsibility to help support students in obtaining those goals. Are there other questions? Well, it's probably a longer answer than you expected, Emily. Sorry, I'm a chatty Cathy. So let's move on to the next phase real quick. So the next phase is analyzing the assessment results. And this is really important because, you know, a lot of times we collect data, but we don't necessarily take the time to analyze and interpret the data. And all of it takes a little bit of effort. So when you're thinking about interest inventories, interviews, observations, a lot of times those kinds of assessments rely on the person administering the assessment to interpret and make meaning out of the results. And so it's really good to have multiple perspectives analyzing that data with you so that it's a more valid data. So if you collect interview data, you've collected the notes, it's really good to share those back with the student, with the family, and other teachers, and have a conversation about those findings so that you can really pull out the actionable knowledge. So what information from that data can you use to make decisions? I think that's one of the key pieces of assessment data is what is it that you can do with the information and what decisions can you make. The other thing is how those findings really kind of match the experiences, perceptions, and expectations. So sometimes we'll conduct an assessment, but the results are way off of what we expected them to be. And there's many reasons that could happen. It could be that the kid just had a really bad day that day and they weren't focused and they just bubbled in things, or they just told you whatever. So you may have to conduct the assessment in a different way or on a different day. And sometimes, again, it's just because the student has just plain changed their mind and we have to kind of redirect. But you're always looking for patterns. So each time you collect some additional data to add to your pile of data in your ongoing process, you're analyzing it to look for patterns and look for things that are going to help that student be successful in post-secondary environments, and then also things that will hinder. If you identify that they have some skills that are going to hinder their success in that environment, then you're going to then focus your instruction and your service on either teaching alternate behaviors or teaching students behaviors that will help them be successful. So again, you're really kind of looking at the holistically, but you do have to take time to analyze the data. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless. And the last part is to use the data. Again, if you just are collecting data for the sake of collecting data, it's kind of pointless. This data actually provides really rich information for the IEP. So we can use it to develop that present levels of academic and functional performance. It gives us really good information about what their strengths are, what their needs are, what their interests are. Again, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, it's a starting point. It will help us determine what those expectations are for post-secondary life. So, and it will help us understand from a student and a family's perspective if those expectations align, because in many cases, what our student expects to do after high school is not the same thing as what our families think will happen after high school. And so we will have to have some additional conversation and again share additional assessment information with the student and family to come to consensus on how best to support the student in achieving their goals. Assessment data also helps us develop the IEP goals, the annual IEP goals. Again, it tells us, the assessment data should tell us what we need to teach. It may also tell us the conditions under which we need to teach them. So when you think about writing a really high quality annual IEP goal, remember it has the conditions, it has the behavior, it has criteria for mastery, and a timeline. So the assessment data is going to tell us the what we have to teach or the behavior, but it also may provide some insight into the conditions necessary for them to achieve that goal. So what instructional strategies we might have to use, what accommodations might be necessary, those kinds of things will help drive the development of annual IEP goals. The other important part of transition assessment is determining appropriate services. Again, services are super important, and they range from time-limited supports to more long-term ongoing supports. And so again, our assessment data can determine if additional assessment needs to happen, or if students need to have some additional career or work-based learning experiences to really further explore their career aspirations. And so that's an important piece. Assessment data also helps determine appropriate course of study, including the ultimate transition service that every student gets is career technical education. And so really thinking about how the assessment data should give you some information about what career field a student might like to go into, which then will help you determine what coursework or what sequence of career technical education courses a student would need to participate in to get more skills or to obtain more skills in that area. So course of study is really good. The last but not least is instruction. So again, thinking about what we do on a day-to-day basis. Our progress monitoring data is transition assessment data. And this data tells us whether we need to keep teaching like we're teaching, or change how we're teaching, or change what we're teaching. And so I think we, again, have to kind of think about transition, not as a separate thing that we do one time a year, but as ongoing progress monitoring, because essentially that's what we're doing. We're painting a picture of how students' skills are evolving over time to help support them in obtaining their post-school goals. So it's going to be really important that we think about how to use this information and use it to guide our instruction. So assessment really is kind of the common thread between all of these pieces of or the requirements of transition. So it again helps us determine the post-school goals, the services, and the annual IEP goals, and then make instructional decisions. And so without assessment data, it's going to be really difficult to make the connections between all of these pieces in the IEP. And so again, when you're thinking about a transition plan, all of these pieces have to relate to each other and connect to each other. And that needs to be really clear when somebody reads it. So if I read an annual IEP goal, then I need to be able to say, okay, yes, that annual IEP goal is going to support them in competitive employment, or that goal is going to support them in going to post-secondary education and training. Or if I look at a service, I want to say, yes, that service will definitely help them reach that post-school goal. So there has to be some alignment between all of these things. And the only way to get that alignment is if we have really strong ongoing assessment data. So time to open it up for questions. And have a great week. So what other questions do you have? So you had some good ones to start with, so keep them coming.
Sometimes we get lots of questions, sometimes we get none.
It's okay.
Well, I guess I will stop the recording at that point. And if anyone has any questions in the future, please feel free to contact Dawn or us at Siebert, and one of us will get you the best answer possible. Have a great day, everybody, and this will be available on the Siebert website in the next couple of weeks to share with anyone who didn't attend today.
Oh, you're very welcome, Helen.